everyone, it's Lexie. So in today's video, I'll be sharing with you books I recommend reading in the fall time. So some of these are ones that I feel like give off like a good spring vibe. They either are like, wet and dreary, like just with that April showers bring May flowers vibes, or books that I feel like, I either read around this time of year or, I think are just, would be fun to read. And they're kind of all over in terms of genre as well. We have some fantasy, we have historical fiction, all these things. So without further ado, let's get started. So first up, I have Dragonfly by Leila Meacham, and this was a historical fiction book that I read kind of during the pandemic, and it is one that has definitely stood out for me. So it follows 5 young Americans that are recruited by the OSS to basically become undercover spies, where they're kind of dropped into Nazi-occupied Paris, and they kind of do some spying for the Allies. So we follow these group of individuals kind of throughout their training process. Oh, and here's Willow. I don't know if you can see her. Throughout this kind of like training process, as they are kind of, learning to work with each other and kind of learning the spy stuff, them eventually kind of, going to Nazi-occupied France as well. But this book starts out several years after the kind of the war, where we know that someone within this group of 5 has died, but there are kind of things going around that make it seem like they are actually alive. So we are kind of, as they're trying to unravel what happened kind of that final day in Paris, we get flashbacks of like them kind of throughout their training and like ultimately leading to that final day. And this one was really fun. I feel like I just had like a very I just felt very anxious reading this, because you see how their web of lies could be unraveled, so you are on edge. And I thought that was something that the author did a really good job at, is where I felt that anxiety, and I felt like at any moment something like so they were going to be figured out, and kind of that suspense and kind of being like a little bit on edge by that made for a really fun reading experience, and trying to figure out what happened, like why it was this person presumed dead. And I feel like this is a good blend of historical fiction mixed with some sort of like espionage and like cat and mouse type of thing. So like I said, this is very unique historical fiction, so definitely was really fun to read, and I cannot recommend it enough. Next, actually, this was another book that I read during the book club that I had with some friends during the pandemic, and it is The Girl with the Louding Voice by Abby DeRay. This is a book that I don't think I necessarily would have picked up by myself, but having read this for the book club, I'm very much glad that I did end up reading it. So it follows this girl named Aduni, who is very young, growing up in, I'm trying to remember, Nigeria, I want to say. Yeah, Nigeria. And she kind of ends up getting, not essentially sold off, but kind of forced to marry this older man when she's still really young. But she always has this dream to find her louding voice, to be able to stand up for herself and kind of do all these things that someone with like an education, to learn to write and have like power in what you say. And it kind of goes off from there. This book is very interesting too, because it's written from Aduni's perspective, where it's not necessarily grammatically correct English, but it does, you do have a little bit of an adjustment period. But I think this one is definitely really worth the read. It's very powerful, and I was really moved by this one, especially everything she has to, persevere and overcome, and just all for striving to have like an education and all these things. So it was really incredibly moving, and I do think this is one that everyone needs to read. So definitely recommend this one. So next, this is a fantasy book, or a trilogy, I guess I should say. And I think it just makes me think of springtime, because I remember reading this right before I graduated from my undergrad. So like April, May-ish, around that time I was reading this trilogy, and it is the Cousins O'Dyer trilogy by Nora Roberts, the first book being The Dark Witch. And this follows kind of like this generational magical feud between this kind of really bad evil sorcerer and this family that was able to, sorry, like the sun's in my eyes, but the family that was able to kind of, not necessarily destroy, but contain this dark evil force for centuries. And he's been slowly kind of building up his strength, and this family, many generations from that initial encounter in like the 1400s or something. But the kind of cousins kind of essentially come together, and they know that they have to defeat this, you know, evil sorcerer. So it's kind of, the trilogy is kind of leading up to that event, and each book in the trilogy follows a different cousin as well. But this one, I don't know, maybe it's because I read this kind of in the springtime that it makes me think of spring, you know, books and things, but it's definitely really fun. It does have a little bit of like romance elements, but and it takes place in Ireland as well, so I feel like it has like that like misty spring wet weather. So definitely this one was, like I said, maybe a little bit more circumstantial in terms of it being a spring read, but nevertheless, this is one that I have really enjoyed. So if you're looking for a unique trilogy, I highly recommend you check this one out. All right, I tried to move out of the sun, but Willow's right here, and I think I made it worse, so I do apologize if this is all funky in the video. But next up, I have The Forgotten Garden by Kate Morton. So this is a book that I read that I feel like gives off such great vibes. So this is one where it's kind of a dual storyline, where we follow this young girl who ends up getting kind of abandoned when her parents, she's basically left alone on this ship. She's abandoned that boards from England to Australia, and she ends up getting adopted by this young family, and they don't tell her she's adopted until she's older, and that essentially really much destroys her sense of self. So we follow this woman who kind of discovers this, and she is kind of on her deathbed at this point, and her granddaughter discovers this mysterious book of fairy tales. There's something off about this book, and when she uncovers that her grandmother was, you know, adopted, and discovers her story of being abandoned on a ship, she wants to she figures there must be some tie to this fairy tale book that, you know, has some connection to her mother's family, so her grandmother's family. So she's trying to uncover this, and we get kind of flashback to the early 1900s, where we follow this woman who lives in kind of poverty in England, and it kind of goes off from there, where you kind of get the unraveling of the story, basically the family history. And what I think really Kate Morton does a really good job is kind of that dual storyline, where you're trying to uncover some mystery or something within history, and kind of going from there, and kind of the weaving of the two storylines, where it doesn't feel like it's stop and go between the two narratives. The author does a really good job at keeping the overarching story kind of progressing between this. And this one I think is my favorite of Kate Morton's. It's between this or The Secret Keeper, but I think this one is my favorite. It is definitely heartbreaking. There's something like whimsical about it, and there is kind of this it takes place on the Cornish coast, so I feel like that just has, again, kind of wet spring vibes as well. So definitely this is very spellbinding, very moving, and a very interesting take on kind of like a historical fiction. And lastly, I do have another historical fiction. Apparently, I think spring is the time for historical fictions, and I have Sunflower Sisters by Martha Hall Kelly. This is kind of the, you know, third and final book in the Faraday trilogy, but you can kind of read them in any order. Basically, it follows this family during kind of major, I guess, U.S. history events. So the first one is World War II, the second one's World War I, and then this one is the Civil War, and it's actually based off of this, loosely based off of this actual family and kind of their, you know, generation of women and their involvement in these kind of major wars. And this one follows, I want to say her name is Georgie Woolsey, who has really much a strong passion to become a nurse during the Civil War. And this one's where we kind of get a bunch of different storylines. We get one perspective of the slave, and I believe one is kind of the slave owner as well. So these kind of storylines become intermingled, and I think it's kind of best not to know too much about like the plot other than kind of that. But what I really like about Martha Hall Kelly and with these kind of 3 books within this trilogy is that the stories, you can see how two storylines are connected, but there's always kind of that third outlier, and kind of eventually they all become woven together. And it's really fun to see how, these three kind of storylines kind of commingle. And yeah, this one is definitely interesting too, because I feel like I haven't read a lot of, I want to say maybe a handful of Civil War historical fiction, and this one was definitely one of my favorites. I've only read a few, but this is definitely the top of my list, I think, in terms of Civil War era historical fiction. And I think it's just so unique. She does try to be, add some historical accuracy in terms of actual people and their roles, but obviously this is fictionalized about them. But it is really fun, it is really moving, and like I said, I cannot recommend this enough. I'm trying to be vague because I think it's best not knowing, too much going into this. So that is it, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments below what some of your spring reading recommendations are and all of that fun stuff. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, and I will see you guys next time. Bye, guys.